Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's program, Insights into the Cow-Calf Enterprise. This is Mary Lynn Collins, coming to you remotely from, actually, I am inside my Oneida County Cooperative Extension office, just so I can be sure to have stable bandwidth and good connection for our evening's program. I'm happy that you could join us. We are going to get underway here shortly. I just wanted to remind those of you who've been waiting patiently, if you could please keep track of your questions that you want to ask, but we ask that you hold them to the end of each of the presenters, and we'll be sure to make time for all your questions tonight. Tonight's program will be recorded, and we'll make that available to participants when that becomes ready for your review. I wanted to be sure to share with you that this evening's program is just one of many livestock programming efforts brought to you tonight in a cooperative effort from livestock educators all across the state, working with Cornell Cooperative Extension. And this is a new group effort that we call the Livestock Program Work Team. So you can be sure to see many more programming efforts coming down the pike to serve all of our livestock needs here across the state, not just beef, but we're going to do our best to cover all the small ruminants, the swine, the horse, and everything in between. So that's some positive things to look forward to in the future from Cornell Cooperative Extension. Without further delay, it's my great pleasure to have our first speaker up tonight is Dr. Rob Lynch, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine. He is the Dairy Herd Health and Management Specialist with PRO-DAIRY from Cornell University. Prior to joining the PRO-DAIRY team in 2016, Dr. Lynch practiced in private industry, providing technical support to dairies across the Northeast. He's got a wide range of expertise, ranging from lameness prevention, neonatal care and obstetrics, right up until immunology as well, plus many more. So we're happy to have you here tonight, Rob. Thank you for making time to share your knowledge and experiences with us for our beef group. I will stop sharing my screen and allow you to put up your presentation, and I'll turn the mic over to you. Thank you so much, Rob.
All right. I'll get my screen up. There it is. All right, now which screen am I showing? Probably the wrong one.
Yes, you need to switch over to, yep, you're good now.
Yeah, I always get that wrong. All right, so good evening, everybody. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Mary Lynn. Thanks, Rich. Thank you to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Livestock Program Work Team for the invitation to participate in tonight's virtual event. I've got a lot to cover this evening and about 45 minutes to do it. So hopefully you don't mind if I move at a pretty brisk pace so we have time at the end to get your questions answered. I'd like to kind of start off with just kind of what's our goal? What's, you know, start with the end in mind. A famous business author, Stephen Covey, is coined the saying, start with the end in mind. And so, you know, this is kind of the end I have in mind. Like, how do we make more high quality product like this for customers to enjoy? And so with those goals, you know, how do I make more high value calves and do that in a way that's as profitable as possible? From a herd health standpoint, you know, things that I feel like I can have an influence on. What can I do to maximize my herd's fertility? What can I do to minimize the chance of problems during the calving period, so I don't lose calves during calving or soon thereafter? How do I minimize calfhood disease until I get them up to weaning time and get them down the road? And how do I do that when still maintaining very efficient and good growth, so I'm kind of maximum value calves that are heading to market? So when I think of things that can have an influence on health, there's a lot of categories that we can consider here. Neonatal diseases like diarrhea, we've got pneumonia issues to tackle, parasitism to try to manage. We've got a breeding program to try to do well. Then there's calving time when we've got to be successful in getting these calves delivered safely. And there's lameness issues. And I'm sure there's other health-related topics that I even forgot to list here. For the interest of time, there's no way I can cover all of these areas well in the time that we have this evening. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on obstetrics and lameness management. Nicole might be able to share with us some obstetrics tips when she starts her presentation. She had an interesting afternoon, I hear. So with these topics in mind, and I'm going to talk a fair bit about vaccines and how they fit into programs. But before we get into the vaccine part of it, there's a lot of things we can do up front to take some of the pressure off of the vaccines that we rely on. And so I borrowed this from Penn State. It's a biosecurity risk assessment tool. There's a lot of small words here on the screen, but it's a way of kind of looking at each disease that you may be confronted with, or your herd may be confronted with, and how likely is it to cause a problem. In green, it means it's unlikely or causes minor problems, all the way up to red, where it's a very serious disease and with significant chance of getting into the herd and causing a lot of problems. And we look at each disease from a risk assessment standpoint to see what kind of risk does this pose to my herd, and then of the management practices that I do day to day, how do they influence the chance of the spread of that disease? It's kind of, so what's the likelihood of this disease getting onto the farm? And once it gets onto the farm, what's the likelihood of it spreading from animal to animal? And are there things that I can do from a prevention standpoint, from a management standpoint, to slow that down or stop it entirely, so I don't have to rely on the animal's immune system and vaccines to fend it off? There's also some innate protections that our animals have that we also have, that really aren't really pathogen specific. They're just in general, they keep the disease out. And those are things like intact barriers, like intact skins and intact mucous membranes. The low pH of our stomach can kill a lot of bacteria that would otherwise make us sick. There's some just normal flora in and on our cattle that help keep other pathogenic diseases away. And then we've got, from our respiratory system and our GI tract, we've got a ciliary system that also kind of helps keep the stuff moving, keeps it from attaching to our tissues and invading and doing damage. There's lots of chemicals, antibacterial proteins that are non-specific and bacteriostatic and help keep us healthy. And then just there's some environments, either lower temperature than ideal for bacteria to replicate, or higher oxygen or lower oxygen that's ideal for some bacteria to replicate, that also keep infection at bay. And then finally, we get to our immune cells. And to start off an immune response, those cells are non-specific. Our neutrophils and macrophages, to start off with, they just start fighting that foreign invader. Doesn't really matter which one it is. They just know it's not supposed to be there, and they kind of get the ball rolling with our immune response. And that non-specific immune system branch, that non-specific immunity, is dramatically reduced when cattle are stressed. And so we do a lot of things to try to minimize stress in the herd, so we don't have an impact on the immune system. So this is, I don't know if those of you remember those commercials from long ago about, this is your brain with the egg, and this is your brain on drugs, and it shows what happens to the egg in the frying pan. So that this image on the far right is the normal intestinal lining. And that's the ciliary, microciliary apparatus that's always there. It helps, get the food, come in contact with the mucosal lining of the small intestine to do digestion, to absorb nutrients, to absorb water, to do all the things that we expect when we deliver a diet. And then you see these pictures of rotavirus and coronavirus intestinal linings. That same ciliary mucosal lining is blunted or completely decimated. So you can see why these calves get diarrhea when they're infected with a rotavirus or coronavirus, because there's just not enough surface area left anymore in their GI tract to do digestion and to do absorption. So pathogens that trigger diarrheal diseases in our calves, these shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody here. We've got our viruses and some common bacteria that we struggle with to keep the herd healthy. So E. coli, Clostridial organisms, Salmonella, all bacteria that cause significant diarrhea in our calves. Coronavirus, rotavirus are very, very prevalent diarrheal viruses that are around and we need to manage. And then we've got some parasites that also cause diarrhea that are difficult to manage sometimes. Cryptosporidium and Coccidia. So I put this table here, and we won't spend a lot of time on each of these, but it just sort of shows kind of an age of when these diseases tend to strike the calves. And sometimes that'll help inform us as to what disease is likely causing this diarrhea. It lists treatment options, and really most of those you'll see are just it's supportive care. It's just time to keep the animal with nutrition and keep the animal hydrated while its intestinal lining heals from whatever that insult was. Most of our prevention measures are through hygiene, just general hygiene measures to minimize exposure to the calves. And then some of those actually, we do have some pretty efficacious vaccines, but several on that list we don't. So we can't hope that we've got a vaccine to help us with this problem. So those are our GI bugs in general. Moving on into some respiratory pathogens. And I think it does help to know a little bit about the enemy you're fighting. It helps us deal with the disease when it shows up, and it helps us prevent the disease so it doesn't happen again. One of the most important pieces of information we have from a diagnostic standpoint is if unfortunately we lose an animal, if we have an opportunity to necropsy that animal, that provides us with, I mean, obviously it's not going to help that animal, but it's going to help us figure out how to maybe modify our treatment approach. If we see it in other animals in the herd, it'll help us modify our prevention measures, and maybe we can tweak our vaccine programs to try to stop it from happening again. So that's a really important piece of information to gather before we compost them. So our viral respiratory pathogens, there's a lot of information on this slide, but one thing you'll notice is a lot of duplication. So bovine respiratory syncytial virus, bovine herpes virus, bovine parainfluenza virus, and BVD virus. I'll talk a little bit more about BVD in a second. But all these viruses kind of do the same thing. They damage that mucociliary escalator, that mucosal lining in the upper airways. It kills off the respiratory epithelium. They cause a lot of inflammation. Some of these viruses cause immune suppression, and it all really kind of sets the stage for bacteria to come in, invade our deeper down into the lung tissue, and that's where most of our death loss is caused from our bacteria insults. But they got in because of the damage done to the upper airways and the immune suppression caused by the viruses. It's not unusual to find the bacteria that causes pneumonia in the upper airways. We can swab normal cattle and recover those pathogens. They just can't get down into the lungs until we do some damage with these respiratory diseases and weaken the immune system. A little bit more on BVD, because we manage this a little bit differently. And I'm sharing these diseases because they are around. These aren't in some other country and something that we won't likely see. These diseases are here, and so we need to manage them. BVD virus, a pestivirus with lots of different substrains. We categorize them as type 1 or type 2 BVD, and you'll see that in your vaccines that they typically will list both. They are categorized also as, from a laboratory standpoint, as cytopathic or non-cytopathic, but I guess the take-home point for that differentiation is that our persistently infected cattle are all coming from non-cytopathic BVD strain infections. BVD, bovine virus diarrhea, it's a bit of a misnomer. I wouldn't think of diarrhea as my first issue when I see BVD, although it can happen. Typically, BVD virus is more associated with primarily reproductive losses, but we can see these calves present pretty sick, respiratory type diseases, and it causes a general immune suppression, and so they succumb to a host of other diseases because the immune system is really knocked out. Where does it come from? It comes from other cattle. It's been documented to be spread by deer as well, but primarily it's a virus spread from cow to cow. So from a prevention standpoint, biosecurity, we think of how is an infected animal going to expose one of my animals? And the things you're already thinking of, fence line in common with other herds, taking animals to places are all chances for exposure to BVD virus. A lot of times this thing will get into a herd and we won't really know exactly how it got there. And maybe we'll have to chalk that up to something trafficking it onto the farm. Maybe it's the deer that are wandering through. And I just put in here a Trojan horse phenomenon because that's really kind of what I think of when I think of BVD's biggest problem for a farm. So think of an animal that catches BVD virus, and when you have BVD virus, you shed that virus, and you'll shed that virus to other members of your herd. And if those other members of your herd don't have any immunity to the virus, they're going to catch it. They're going to get infected. They're going to get viremic. Viremic means virus in the bloodstream. Virus circulating in the bloodstream, it just goes everywhere. It wreaks havoc pretty much everywhere. And one place it really wreaks a lot of havoc is in the uterus. And so when we think of BVD, we think of those reproductive problems. When a pregnant cow, no matter how early in her pregnancy, is exposed to BVD virus and the virus gets in her bloodstream and exposes her reproductive tract, we run into the issues that cause us our biggest headaches. And that's early embryonic loss, where we don't maybe even realize the cow was pregnant because the virus knocked it out and she just comes back into an unusual heat later. It may, later on in the pregnancy, you may notice an abortion, you may notice stillbirth situations. You may notice even, a live calf born, but it's weak or deformed. Oddly enough, maybe the exposure happened late enough in the pregnancy. The calf already had a functional immune system in utero, comes out normal calf in every way. Our biggest issue here is if that exposure happens in the middle of gestation, right around the time the calf is as a fetus developing its own immune system, it sees this BVD virus and sees it as itself. And it just decides this BVD virus is part of me. It's supposed to be here. I'm never going to get rid of it. So these calves are born persistently infected. These are our PI calves, and they will never get rid of this virus as long as they live. And some live to a ripe old age. You'd think they'd be, poor doers and runty looking things, and we'd lose them due to other causes along the way. And sometimes that happens, but there are some pretty, it's been documented, some thriving PI calves. And those are our typhoid Marys. They're shedding copious amounts of BVD virus in their environment, exposing the rest of the herd, including your next group of pregnant cows, making next season's PI calves. And it's sort of just perpetuates itself that way. So we deal with this with vaccination, and we also deal with the biosecurity, and we deal with it with some diagnostic approaches. And we look at BVD testing as a good way of keeping BVD virus out of the herd. And so, again, these are super shedders. They'll never get rid of it. We want to find out who our PI animals are. And there are lots of ways to approach this diagnostically, but from just a general maintenance approach, we test our newborn calves. The younger you figure out they've got it, the sooner you can make a decision to have that animal removed from the herd. And then we got to start doing some additional trace backs to understand, how did this calf that was just born, how did she get BVD virus? Maybe she was exposed in utero, and that's where the PI calf came from. Or maybe her dam was a PI, and that's possible. And a lot of PIs are made that way. So we go back and we test her her dam, make sure that she's not also a PI calf. And again, there's lots of ways to do this, to work with your veterinarian as far as, from a BVD screening and eradication standpoint. There's lots of different approaches and lots of different tests out there. All right, back to our pathogens, back to pneumonia. Once the viral pneumonia sets up, then we're kind of sitting ducks for bacterial pneumonia. And these bugs probably aren't isn't really news to you all. We've got Mannheimia hemolytica, Pasteurella multacida, Staphylococcus somni. All of these pathogens can be found normally in the upper airways, and they move down when their upper respiratory systems are weakened. And they all can set up a significant pneumonia and many times fatal, especially if missed early on. Mycoplasma bovis, another highly contagious pneumonia-causing pathogen. We struggle with this bug a lot on the dairies, and we see it quite a bit also in the feedlots. And so it responds to antibiotics a little differently than the other bugs. But again, it's one of those pathogens that we can find in a normal animal. Another thing different about this bug is we really don't have a good vaccine for this one at this point, compared to those other bugs I've listed. Salmonella, we classically think of this bug as a diarrhea-causing organism, but there are strains that do target the respiratory system more so, Salmonella Dublin specifically. And so we don't want to miss the chance of diagnosing a salmonella case if we see some unusual pneumonia. And I put a vaccination question mark here because it kind of depends on which salmonella we're talking about, if there really is a vaccination approach to prevent this or not. So we got some other diseases that are included in our vaccine programs. I listed a few of them here. So leptospirosis, that's out in the environment. It's typically carried in a host of maintenance species, and the maintenance host doesn't actually tend to get sick from this bug. It's just when it gets into some of the non-host adapted species does it cause problems. And so if you think you can keep lepto off your farm, and you see the list of critters here, you can see it's going to be pretty frustrating prospect to keep lepto off the farm. And so that's why we tend to include it in a lot of our vaccine programs. It's primarily a reproductive disease. We think of abortion when we think of lepto, but there are clinical presentations of this disease as well. Vaccines are pretty effective at managing this bug, so that's why we use them commonly. Clostridium, another pretty nasty pathogen. There's a host of terrible diseases. Many lead to very quick death, and we try to minimize clostridial diseases as much as possible, and that's why this one's often included in our vaccine programs as well. It's the toxin that does the disease from this bacteria, and it really survives quite well in the environment. So it's, from a practical standpoint, we can't really keep that can't really practically keep that away from our herd. So that's why we definitely want to consider vaccines for this bug, or this host of bugs. Pink eye, this may or may not cause issues with your herd, but it's these Moraxella bacteria do quite well on the surface of the eye and tend to eat into the cornea, and that's why we see our classic pink eye lesions. So they're very painful. They really can interfere with animals, just animals doing what they want to do. It tends to be a seasonal disease, although I have seen it in the off season, but we tend to deal mostly with pink eye issues in the summertime when flies are the culprit for carrying that bug from eye to eye. We can control this pathogen in a number of ways, and I feel like this is something that should be approached from a multi-prong strategy, where we want to minimize fly breeding, keep the fly populations down, try to keep the flies away from the cattle with your tags and your sprays and your back rubbers and things. And there are some pretty, there's several varieties of vaccination available out there. Some have shown some pretty good efficacy, and so often find these in vaccination programs during the summertime. obviously there's more bugs out there. And so I just want to put in a recommendation for, building your herd specific vaccine programs based on your challenges and your management strategies. And so these are best customized from one farm at a time. Work with your veterinarian to come up with what works best for the situation that you find your herd under. And ABP recently, actually, we haven't quite got it out the door yet, but I've been on a committee developing vaccination guidelines through my professional association, the American Association of Bovine Practitioners. And taking a similar approach to our equine practitioner colleagues, breaking out our vaccines into two categories: core vaccines and risk-based vaccines. And core vaccines are the ones that pretty much, these are significant diseases and they're pretty much everywhere, so they probably ought to be part of everyone's vaccine program. And those include IBR, BVD, BRSV, PI3S, and our Clostridial vaccines. And then we've got a bunch of others, and we'll call those risk-based vaccines. And these are going to be used farm specific. One farm may need it, the next farm may not. It's all based on the risk assessment you do with your veterinarian to try to identify, do these vaccines have a place in my management strategy, and how do I fit them in a way that's going to be practical to get done and still provide protection for my herd. And some of these you may be surprised to see, like lepto. I use lepto vaccines on a lot of my programs. I am a fan of the scours vaccines, but these are considered risk-based and used on a farm-by-farm basis. And your bacterial pneumonia vaccines, some farms need to use them, and some can get by just fine without them. Pink eye vaccines as well. And so we look at these risk-based vaccines as a as-needed basis. Trying to back it up a little bit further, not just vaccines, we use a lot of things that stimulate an immune response. And so breaking down simply to passive versus active immunity. Passive immunity, it's exactly that. I don't trigger an immune response when I give a passive immune product. And what I'm talking about here specifically are antibodies. So like tetanus antitoxin, E. coli antibody boluses. These are antibodies made by some other animal, and I give it to the animal that I want to deliver immediate short-term protection. So fast, I need it there so quickly that the animal really doesn't have time to mount an immune response. An immune response takes weeks to develop. And so if I need something quicker than that, I'm probably going to reach for an antibody product where I'm going to get some immediate passive protection. The downside is there is no immune response. The animal doesn't see it, so that protection is only lives as long as the antibodies stick around, and there's no memory generated by the animal's immune system. It's all been provided by someone else. So that's passive immunity. Compare that to active immunity. This is what we're trying to do with our vaccine programs. We're giving vaccines to trigger immune response so that animal's immune system is prepared should it actually see the real disease later, prepared to mount an efficient, robust response that's going to adequately eliminate that pathogen. So we don't even see any of the downsides of the infection. They don't show any symptoms because their immune system was so ready to deal with it that it cleared it before it had a chance to do any damage. And so these, they take, like I said, they take a few weeks to develop, many 3, 4, some even 6 to 7 weeks to develop a significant, the time needed to develop a significant immune response. But once that immune response is triggered, it's longer lasting. We can get into the order of like once a year, I've got to remind the immune system once I get that memory system built up. And so we break these up into a couple of different categories, and I'll address those now. Amongst our vaccines, we've got our inactivated, or better known as killed vaccines. And they're just that. I take the pathogen and I kill it, I break it up, and there's kind of bits and pieces of antigen that I deliver in the vaccine that it shows like the roadmap of sorts to the body. And so those antigens, our immune system will see those antigens and will develop an immune response to those antigens. It's not a great immune response, but it's pretty good. And a couple of things we can do to try to spruce that up a little bit. One thing you'll notice with a lot of killed vaccines is I have to booster them. If they've never seen the vaccine before, one shot just doesn't cut it. And if I can't keep the booster recommendation, I'm really wasting my money on the first vaccine. So make sure you get that booster dose in there if they've never seen it before. The other thing they do with killed virus or killed vaccines is they'll add some extra adjuvants or irritants in there. I'll get to that in a minute. So things like toxoids, I'm going to develop an immune response to the toxin released by the bacteria. Bacterins, I'm going to generate antibodies to the bacterial cell wall. So when the real bacteria gets in, I've got antibodies at the ready to address that infection. So from killed to modified live, or we call these attenuated vaccines. So it is the pathogen, but it's been altered or mutated, or it's been shifted to a form that no longer causes illness. But it's the pathogen. It gets in, it attaches, it replicates, it behaves in the way very similar to the actual disease, just without any of the symptoms. And because it replicates and it divides and it presents antigen, it really allows the immune system to see it well, to respond to it robustly, and we get a better immune response to our live vaccines as compared to our killed vaccines. I want to mention briefly about adjuvants. Adjuvants are chemical irritants included in vaccines to provide a non-specific boost to the immune response to the vaccine. Our killed vaccines rely on them heavily. We're seeing live vaccines now, including some adjuvants as well. And so I guess the best way to think of them is non-specific immune irritants. Like aluminum hydroxide is an example of an adjuvant you'll see listed on some of the vaccine you use. They do increase our immune response, but they can be reactive. Like I said, they're irritants, and some animals react to them. So injection site lesions, swellings, some of the more annoying side effects of vaccination, we often think the adjuvants are playing more of a role here. So modified live versus killed virus vaccines. I'm going to poll the audience here because I'm not sure what's the most popular out there right now. So I'm going to ask you, what type of viral respiratory vaccines do you use in your herd? Or is it a killed virus predominantly, modified live predominantly? Do you use a little of both? Maybe you're not using any. I'll give that a little bit of time to cook. People think, what do I have in my refrigerator? So I'm seeing a pretty broad mix here. That's interesting. And I see almost a quarter of our participants indicating none, which I'm a little surprised to see. So here are our results. If you didn't see them before, pretty much an even split across the board, with modified lives kind of winning out as the most often used the folks here in our meeting. So advantages and disadvantages. I think these vaccines have their place, and they have places where they fit well and places where they don't. Looks like Joe's trying to get in. So modified live viruses, pros and cons. Like I mentioned, a robust immune response when these are used correctly. I get an immune response off the first injection. Not to say that I might not follow up with a future injection to add to that immune response, but I will see some protection right off the bat with one. We rely a little less on our adjuvants here, so they tend to be a little less reactive when we give them. And they are a lower cost per dose. I used to work in pharmaceutical industry where we produce vaccines, and I learned that it's pretty expensive to make killed vaccines. So it's a lower cost per dose as long as you can use all those doses. And that's sort of the cons is, one is they're delicate and they have to be used right away once they're reconstituted. And you can really, if you don't handle them correctly, you can really ruin a live virus vaccine pretty easily. So we have to make sure we're taking care of these vaccines. Can't use them later, can't put them in the fridge and pull them up next week when you've got another group of animals to do. And if check your labels, some of these are not safe to give in all animals. And so read your labels closely. Animals given these modified lives, if they haven't had it before as non-pregnant animals and they get it for the first time as a pregnant animal, that can cause abortion. So we have to make sure we're following our label directions very closely. Compare that to our killed virus vaccines. Again, pros and cons. Probably not going to have unused doses here. I can get a tank and I can pull that out as needed. Although read your labels here, it also says once you break that vial, once you break the seal, you should use the entire contents when first opened. And we don't do that per se, but I've seen some vaccine bottles poorly handled, highly contaminated, that really are probably causing more disease than preventing. So we have to, even though it's killed, we still have to take good care of our vaccine. They tend to be safe across the board, although check your animal age restrictions, make sure the label says it's safe to give to the group of animals you're intending to give it to. Certainly some convenience here because they're pretty much ready to go, and you just can use them as needed. They tend to be a little more reactive because of the adjuvant systems I mentioned. The immune response is a little narrower, like I mentioned before. They often, almost always have a booster associated with them. And again, they tend to be a little higher cost per dose as a whole. These two varieties of vaccine are often used together. Like I'll start with modified lives in my calves, and I'll switch over to killeds in my adult pregnant cattle. And there's some really good data that shows that those strategies are quite efficacious. So let's get into the age of vaccination, because it can be really tricky sometimes. We're trying to figure out, when do I start my calves? When can I get a good immune response in my young stock before they go ahead and get sick with the real disease? So I borrowed this graphic from Dr. Chris Chase, is at North Dakota. And the y-axis shows antibody titers in circulation, and the x-axis on the bottom is just time, and that time in days, weeks, months. And so we'll see that when a calf is successful in getting on mom and getting a good drink of colostrum, we'll see her mom's antibodies in the circulation come to a high number. And then they get used up, they go away, they disappear. And there's a point in time where that antibody level is no longer protective. And so we like it when our calves have their antibody numbers above this protective level against whatever the disease we're trying to be protected from. And once it falls below that level, that animal's kind of, now she's at risk, or he's at risk of getting sick from the disease. Now, to make matters worse, their immune system isn't fully developed. And sometimes these animals are several months of age before they can actually make their own antibodies. And that's the challenge. They can't make their own antibodies yet, but mom's antibodies have already dropped below a level that's protective. To make matters worse, and we call that the window of susceptibility. It's that time when she doesn't have mom's protection anymore, but she can't really mount a response to her own, to a vaccine if we give it to her yet. And to make matters worse, sometimes the titers are below protective level, but still too high that they end up getting in the way of our vaccination. And we call that maternal antibody interference. It's there, it just gets in the way of the animal's own immune system from mounting a good immune response to a vaccine. So we're always trying to pick that perfect window of, when do I start my vaccinations? When am I going to get a good response? If I start too early, the vaccine doesn't work. If I start too late, the animal's already gotten sick from the disease I wanted to use my vaccine to protect them from. So there's a real art and science to trying to put together these vaccine programs in our calves. So in come intranasal vaccines. That's a newer entry to the vaccine world. And they have some perks about them that make them pretty nice from a disease prevention standpoint. One, we're delivering the antigen by the route in which the diseases that we're trying to protect against typically invade from. And so it makes sense that if we show the immune system in the upper airways what these viruses look like, they're going to do a pretty good job mounting a response to fend it off. They drive the immune system to the site of infection pretty well, and they're less impacted by that maternal antibody interference. And so it's good that if the vaccine company can provide a study that shows that, but mucosal immunity, when delivered through the intranasal route, and we have oral vaccines as well, can somewhat get around that maternal antibody interference problem. Moving on to our scours vaccines, these are also pretty special in how they behave and what they do for us. A couple things to keep in mind here. A cow makes colostrum and starts moving antibodies from her bloodstream into her mammary gland pretty early on, 5-6 weeks before she actually calves. She's starting to move those antibodies into the mammary gland. And so if we want to get some bang from our buck, we want these vaccines to actually get into the mammary gland where they need to be. We got to start the vaccinations pretty early on in the pregnancy, in order for her to have time to mount an immune response to the antigens we gave her, so those antibodies get into the bloodstream, and then she starts putting them into her mammary gland. And so you think of an animal that's never seen a scours vaccine before, they tend to have boosters. So we're really backing that calendar up quite a few weeks in order to really get the most bang for our buck on this particular vaccine. The other challenging part of this vaccine is just because mom made the antibodies, the calf's still not protected. None of these antibodies cross through into the calf in utero. It has to get into the colostrum, and that calf's got to eat that colostrum in a timely manner to get any benefit from these scours vaccines. And so if she's not getting on mom herself, we're going to have to step in and provide some help to make sure she gets antibodies on time. 6 hours, we want to make sure that calf's on mom or getting a good drink of colostrum before 6 hours of age to get that protection he or she needs in the first few weeks to months of life. And then subsequent years, we can just do that annual booster, but just keeping in mind how long it takes for mom to make antibodies and move them into her mammary gland. Another thing on vaccines would be just keep an eye on these inserts. It's really small print, but there's a ton of really useful information on these vaccine inserts that come with your products. And so peel them off the bottle, open them up, take them out of the box, give them a read, get your reading glasses, maybe a magnifying glass. But there's some very pertinent information you need to know about these things printed right there. And they change often. So just keep tabs on what these companies are providing information-wise for the products. So I put an example program here, and this is really just for example purposes. Work with your veterinarian to come up with what kind of program makes sense for your herd. But I broke it up into 3 groups. I made the assumption for the herd that I was thinking of that they don't have bulls to deal with. So by breeding with AI, they just got their calves and their cows and their replacements to deal with. And so starting with calves, we got to get them out off the ground right. And so starts right at birth with colostrum, opportune time to grab that PI test and get the navel dipped. And then we kind of look at opportunities down the road. When can I handle these animals again to get some good vaccine going? And so we can get them started usually 3, 4, 5, 6 months of age. We can get started with our vaccines, and obviously these animals have never had vaccines before, so vaccines that need boosters, make sure we incorporate another opportunity to make sure that booster shot gets into them. And then we get down to, if this is a spring calving herd, we're talking about fall weaning, getting them ready for that to head off to the next stop, get them ready for market. And we want to make sure that whatever we're doing in this pre-weaning and phase from a vaccination and deworming standpoint, that it's going to match up well with the preconditioning program for the market that we're shooting for. For the cows, we want to make sure that we're getting them primed before they calve, giving enough time to respond to a scours vaccine if we're going to use that. Then we got to get them ready for breeding time. So springtime, we're going to think about our reproductive vaccines and our respiratory vaccines. This is when we're starting to think about summertime pasture issues. So, we got parasites to deal with and pink eye to deal with. And so consider those this time as well. I put a plus or minus on the deworming. I hope I have time to get into deworming at the end because we're dealing with some issues with dewormer resistance. in livestock. And so how we go about giving dewormers to our herds is starting to shift. And then come preg check time, we can booster that lepto and vaccine and think about some fall parasite control strategies. We got those in between animals. They're not calves anymore. They've seen vaccines, but they're not adults yet either. And so we just want to make sure they don't we don't lose ground on their vaccines. And so we think about springtime shots and fall time boosters. So I included an annual calendar here of, just for that herd I had in mind of when we might be bringing animals in and doing our herd health program at strategic times throughout the year. So that's it on the vaccine end. I know I'm up on 45 minutes here, Rich. So how want me to wrap things up now? A few more minutes.
Well, I know we have a second speaker, so if you could try to wrap things up in 1 or 2 minutes and then maybe take 1 or 2 questions, and then we could probably move on to Nicole. And if we have time at the end, we could come back for more questions.
Sure. All right. Yeah, so I'll get things wrapped up here. I just wanted to put in a strong recommendation for body condition scoring. I know a lot of you probably do this on a routine basis, but there's a lot of value in knowing the body condition of the herd. And maybe most importantly, we can really tighten up our breeding window if we get the body condition correct at the time of calving and at the time of breeding. And this just shows what happens to days to first estrus from calving if that body condition falls short. We can really stretch out our calving window if we're not careful. Internal parasites, like I mentioned, a lot of things changing here. So that whole just spring fall deworming strategy, that's not going to hold for very long for us. So we're looking at ways to do fecal egg counts on some manure samples, get an understanding of how well our dewormings are actually clearing parasites in our herd, make sure that our dewormers are actually working, and coming up with different pasture management strategies to not eliminate all of the eggs off the pasture. We want to leave a host population of non-resistant eggs, non-resistant worms in the fields to outcompete our resistant parasites. And so FDA has a really nice Refugia website here. I included the tiny URL. It's tinyurl.com, FDA Refugia. That'll get you to their website, or just Google FDA Refugia. It's a really nice video that explains what Refugia is and how we can modify our parasite management that way. Don't really have time to get a lot into the breeding, so maybe we can touch on that if we've got time a little later. So yeah, I apologize for that. I just ran out of time. So last thing I wanted to mention is just some of the common issues I've run into over the years. Facilities that just make it really hard or unsafe to get the job done well. I see a lot of vaccine programs that leave out the boosters where they really need them. I don't see a lot of really good records. People aren't writing this stuff down as they do them. And so we really need to track this stuff. It'll help us be better managers. I don't see a lot of effort in the biosecurity plans to really do what we can to keep disease off the farm. And I see a lot of guessing at body weight. If we're going to dose animals with anything that requires a correct body weight, we really want to make sure that we're accurate in those assessments. So we huge swings on under and overdosing animals because we think we know what they weigh. So with that, I'll apologize for going long. Have time for a quick question, Rich.
Yes, if anyone has a question, you should feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, or put it into the chat, and we'll try to get it asked. You should feel free as these sessions go along to put any question you have in the chat. So does anyone have a question right now?
Rob, I have a question for you. This is Mary Lynn. Referring back to your core set of vaccines, the core group that you discussed, are those all available for intranasal, or just some are at this point?
Just some are at this point. Our respiratory, our viral respiratories, and a couple of our bacteria, pneumonia-causing organisms are available in an intranasal form.
Okay, thank you.
It's a hot area of vaccine research, so I expect we'll see some more.
Any more questions for Rob before we prepare for our second speaker for the night? Well, if not, I'm going to turn the mic over to Rich Tabor. Rich is the grazing specialist and AED specialist out of Shenango County, and he is going to introduce our second speaker for tonight, Nicole Tommell. Rich, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary Lynn. I'm Rich Tabor with Shenango County Extension, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our next speaker here, Nicole Tommell. She is the Area Ag Business Management Specialist and Team Leader for the Central New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team, which covers an 8-county region in the Central New York State. Nicole received her bachelor's degree in ag business from SUNY Cobleskill, and she has a master's in ag ed from North Carolina State. And she was a teacher at SUNY Cobleskill prior to coming to work with us on Extension, teaching ag business and animal science. And what's notable about Nicole is she has a lot of practical hands-on experience. She's a co-owner of a diversified cattle operation and a past president of the New York Angus Association, and is actively involved in FFA and 4-H. Well, with that, I guess we'll turn it over to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Rich. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Tommell, and I'm coming to you from Fonda, New York, Montgomery County. That's my home. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about benchmarking. And so just let me get my PowerPoint up here. And I will say I am a little tired. I had a really hard calving this afternoon. We had to have a C-section. We had a C-section on a cow. It was like 4 hours long. I'm really tired. So I'm gonna work through this. Please bear with me. I appreciate Dr. Rob for coming in and starting off the program. And anyway, so like Rich said, we do have a cow-calf operation as well as a diversified feeding operation. We feed Holstein steers for slaughter. So that is our primary business. Been with Extension for almost 3 years. And prior to that, I did teach at Cobleskill. So thank you very much for that introduction, Rich. So that's just a little bit about me. And hopefully everyone can see my main. And we also have a fairly large sheep herd, which is right in the middle of lambing too. So we've got that going on, and my son just called me. So hopefully there's nothing going on in the barn. It's crazy. It's a crazy time of the year for us. All right, so we are going to talk about benchmarking the cow-calf operation this evening and the importance of data in your herd. I really feel that data, as much data as you collect, is important. And I know that Dr. Rob did talk about that a short while ago. And we are going to talk a little bit about performance data and the reason why being able to capture weights, being able to vaccinate properly and have that data, being able to just to be able to manage your cow herd in a very comfortable way so that no one's getting hurt, but yet you're still being able to get those numbers. So the one thing I want to point out to people is that the cow-calf business is, on average, largely a part-time endeavor. I have had so many people call me and say to me, I want to retire on 20 beef cows. That's fantastic. Unfortunately, when you start to do the numbers, that is a very hard thing to do. So we're going to talk about how we derive those numbers. And the reason why I say that is because on average, the average number of cows is only 50 head or fewer in the entire United States. And that's 80% of the farms. So of all the farms and ranches in the US, 80% of them are 50 head or less. Farms and ranches that are 100 to 499, so they don't use that 500 number, but 100 to 499 is 8.7%, which is 38% of the cow inventory. And then less than 4% actually derive their entire sole income on the cow-calf operation. So those are some good numbers for you to kind of think about when we're going through this. But when we're thinking about the cow-calf business, we can use that to enhance your farm operation, whether you're diversifying or maybe offsetting your farm for tax purposes, things like that. But there are some good benefits to how a cow-calf operation, but you still need to be somewhat profitable. Okay, so if you take a quick Google search, we want to know what the word benchmark means. Well, benchmark, the noun, is the standard or point of reference against which things may be compared or assessed, with the verb being evaluating or checking something by comparison. So tonight we're going to talk about benchmarking your numbers against actual numbers that are derived from farms all across America. So I took this from Dr. Mike Baker, and I like to just take a quick brief overview of the characteristics of a beef operation. So you have three main enterprises, which one is the cow-calf, and if you look, the investment can be very high. The labor amount is moderate, and then the labor skill is low. You need to have some facility. You need to have a lot of land base. Land quality is low, and market risk is low also. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. What's the matter, Mark? Sorry, everyone. So if you look also, I did also have stocker backgrounding operations, and feed yard operations. So that's basically three different operations you can look at. Your cow calves are going to sometime go to a stocker backgrounder if you don't keep them. And then ultimately they are going to go to a feed yard. So when we start to look at this, here's, oops, a little bit too quick there. This is kind of a nice pie chart from Beef Production 101. It's a nice pie chart of where we are starting to spend our money, whether it's interest or miscellaneous items, your pasture, your forages, your feeds, your minerals. That's about 60% of what you are dealing with. That is the crux of your money. So we really need to focus on that when we start to look at benchmarking and looking at caring for your livestock. Again, another neat little graph here, which is basically your annual return on your cow-calf operation. If you kind of look through, you kind of sort through, obviously 2014 to 2016, that was a blip of a year. Cow-calf, the cow herd was very small, so prices were very high. And then it dipped back down into 2016. So 2014, 2015 was kind of an anomaly. And a lot of people like to go back and look at those numbers and say, well, why aren't we there? And I have to actually update this graph, but this gives you a nice piece of information on where we are. And we haven't been that great for the last 5 years. If you look at the way prices are, yes, the packers are making great money, but the cow-calf dwindled from the feed yard, dwindled down to the cow-calf. We are shrinking in our annual returns. So a little bit more from Dr. Mike Baker at Cornell. He did talk about, and we can talk a little bit more about this, but my biggest thing here, and we're going to get through, I'm just showing you numbers because we're going to talk about how we derive these numbers. That's really the crux of my presentation this evening, but looking at average, minimum, maximum, how are we going to get these numbers? We're going to talk about how we're going to benchmark these numbers, how we're going to do that for your herd. So if you look, We look at some variable costs per cow, whether it's your feed costs, your labor costs, veterinary costs. I know my veterinary cost today is going to skyrocket because of having a C-section, but that all has to be brought into your economics when you're thinking about your cow herd. Your cost of return projections, that's another one that we like to talk about. Again, your fixed costs, we do have depreciation, whether it's on machinery or barns or your, there is depreciation. You do have interest and insurance and other miscellaneous. So there are some fixed costs that go on to get tacked on to a per cow basis. Those are all things, again, we're going to talk about how we're going to derive those shortly. But I just like to give people a 30,000 foot view before we dive down into the nitty gritty. Again, a little bit more with steers versus heifers, selling steer calves versus heifer calves versus cull cows versus cull heifers. Where does that shake out? So how do cattlemen and cattlewomen benchmark? Number one, these are the 4 key items that we need to think about. Number one is know your herd performance data. Herd performance data is extremely important when you are looking at benchmarking. It doesn't matter how you do it, but it's important to have it. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment. What are the herd strengths and weaknesses? Have you guys ever done a SWOT analysis for your herd? Identify gross income benchmarks. So where's our income? And then our economic summarizations. So we have all this data, but how are we summarizing it? So those are the 4 main focuses that I like to look at when we're benchmarking livestock operations or cattle operations. So first, herd performance data. And if you're looking at your herd performance data, how many people know how many cows they have that are calving in? How many people know their pregnancy rates or their pregnancy losses? What your culling percentages or your calving percentage? These are all items that we need to know in order for us to understand our benchmarking performance data. It doesn't matter if you use an Excel spreadsheet, if you use some type of app on your phone. There's a tremendous amount of apps out there currently that help you collect this data. I have Rancher on here. I know that we also, it's funny because just for calving purposes at our farm, we use MooCall. It's a calving sensor that helps us so that we know when calvings are going to occur. That's really helped us focus on our cows. Keeping that cattle record handbook, whether it's written in pen. I know that some folks will actually get, it's like a little black book that if it gets wet, you can still write in it. It doesn't bleed over. It's kind of a calving book. But your collection of data is super important. And it's not just on the calf, that it's got to follow through to the cow. So your cow needs to be, when was she bred? What was she bred to? How did she wean off her calf the year before? What was her body condition score? All those things are going to help you determine whether or not that cow is going to be profitable for you. Is she a cow that just is really heavy? Is she a really easy keeper? Is she very thin-hided and she needs a lot of feed in order to maintain her body weight? Those are things that you need to really think about when you're collecting data, because your herd performance data is directly correlated. Calves that wean off heavier, calves that are born earlier will wean off heavier. Your tighter calving windows, those all will help increase pounds, which is ultimately what you would like to do, and also get those cows bred back in a normal calving fashion. So are you using Excel spreadsheets? Are you using apps on your phone? What exactly are you using to collect your data? The next thing that we like to talk about is our strengths and weaknesses of the herd. How many people have ever thought about the strengths and weaknesses of their herd? Probably not too many. However, it's really important when you're thinking about benchmarking. So I would challenge people to really take out a piece of paper and a pencil and start thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of your herd. Because if you don't know where to really look to tighten up your herd. You don't know where to look in order to offset your expenses or any of your inputs. So you really need to think about your weaknesses in your herd. Do you have a long calving season? Do you have a really short calving season? Do you calve all year? I know that there's people out there that calve all year long. I'm not a big proponent of that. I like a nice tight calving window. I like to be 70 days max, breed my cows back, and away we go. Maybe that's really optimistic. I know that some people are even tighter. Some people are at 45 days. But what's your calving window? Are you 5 months? Are you 3 months? Are you 6 months? Or are you in a whole year? With a long calving season, my concern is you're not able to get a nice group of feeder calves together to sell to your buyer or to the sale barn or however you're marketing your calves. You may have small calves, you may have large calves, you don't have a nice uniform animal. Without that uniform animal, you're not going to be able to command the price that you deserve because your calving window is too large, and then ultimately it is hurting you economically. What's your pounds weaned at weaning? Are you a 7-month-old calf that's 400 pounds? I know that some people will have 7-month-old calves that are 6, 7. I've seen monster calves at 8 months old. Your pounds at weaning, that again affects your pocket. What's your mortality and morbidity? Dr. Rob did a really nice job with his vaccination protocols and schedules. I'm a huge proponent of a good vaccination program. It will decrease your calf mortality because you want to get those calves to weaning, because they're going to be what generates dollars for you to pay for your cows for the next year. Morbidity is just a poor doing calf. Did that calf get pneumonia and he just doesn't look right? When he goes to the sale barn or you have your buyer come in, he'll probably kick him out or he'll pay you less for him. But by having a really good vaccination schedule and protocols, the risk of having dead calves or calves that are poor doers, it goes down. So more calves that you can sell equate to, again, obviously more cows, more calves, more dollars, more pounds. What's your cull rate? Do you cull heavy? Do you cull light? Do you save every cow, even if she has a poor doing calf at the end of the year? So cull rates is important. Do you cull cows that are thin-hided and that are just kind of hard to keep weight on? You know, what's your cull rate? Easy flushing cows that are efficient and breed back quickly. Those are the cows that we want. We want moderate, sturdy cows that will go out and they'll graze pasture. They'll raise a really good calf and they'll get bred back. We don't want non-breeders. We don't want cows out of our calving windows. Those are all things that are stressful on your herd. And again, that just ends up hurting you in the pocketbook. And so that really helps you with your benchmarking, is by having this performance data, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of your herd. So now you're collecting an entire body of work. And this takes time because obviously you can't benchmark yourself against yourself or against other herds, which I'll show you how to do momentarily, until you have this type of information. So one of the ways to benchmark and to look at your gross income benchmarks is to look at your annual profit and loss for the cow herd. Whether you're record keeping on a financial basis, whether it's through FinPac or FinBin with extension, you can go and you can work with folks in FinPac. There's a lot of my colleagues that will actually create a FinPac program for you, and they will continue to do this annually, collect all the data, they can summarize it for you, and then you can utilize FinBin in order to, and we'll look at that in a moment, in order to create scenarios to and summaries in order to benchmark yourself. My one question is record keeping, whether it's performance driven or economic, having a shoebox in your office or on your kitchen table, it doesn't cut it. You need to have a solid record keeping system. I know that my colleagues and we are very big proponents of using a QuickBooks or an Excel spreadsheet or something in order to keep track of your records and to be able to create a profit and loss and an income statement. Not a lot of people do that, but how do you know your numbers? How do you know what happened from January to December in your cow herd if you don't exactly know where you are? You know, how much did your feed cost? How much did your hay cost? What were your taxes? Sometimes people keep things within their personal checking account, and I really try to tell folks to make sure that that's out of their checking account. You'd be surprised. I know a lot of people are saying, Nicole, I don't do that. You would be surprised at how many folks actually keep their personal checking account with their farm account, and they can't differentiate. It's just kind of all together. I really try to have folks pull that stuff out and start their own checking account so that you can have your own annual profit and loss of the cow herd. Being able to determine what your cull cows were, how many cull cows you had, what their price was, how many heifers you had to send to town, how many calves you sent, where did they go. Those profit and loss benchmarks are very, very important, especially when you're trying to determine how to increase profitability overall. The one thing I'd like to point out here, and I do have a link here, it's called the cow-calf cost calculator. It's through the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. It's an Excel spreadsheet that you can actually go in and you can type in your data and you can create a cow-calf cost. I really like this. It's quick, it's easy. There are some options on there that don't pertain to us, obviously, because it is University of Nebraska Lincoln. You know, Western cow-calf ranches are a little bit different than we are, obviously. However, go in, you can take a look at it and see if that works for you. That might help you. Using FinPac is another one. Again, talk to my folks at Extension and we would be able to certainly assist you. What we do is we create, we just basically create a database with all of your information in it. FinBin is the Farm Financial and Production Benchmark information. If you see over on the left of your screen, you can generate reports for your whole farm, crop, livestock. And what ends up happening is you go in and you look at it, you take the livestock and with, oh, I thought I had that. So what you would do is you would click livestock to generate a benchmark report. New York State is not in there, but Pennsylvania is. Obviously, that's the closest to us. So you could click on Pennsylvania, drop down menu for the cow-calf herd, and then you would be able to look at the benchmarking information for Pennsylvania so that we can look at that against our own, because you can't benchmark your numbers if you don't have numbers to benchmark against. So by utilizing FinBin, we can start to use some numbers in a greater population. Okay. So when we start to look at examples of the gross income of on a per cow basis, if you look on the left, this is, well, this is North Dakota, but this was a good example because your herd would be over on the right-hand column, and on the left would be, for instance, the Pennsylvania numbers. So it looks at your beef cows sold, beef calves transferred out. I would not worry about that, but your cull sales, if you butchered anything, any type of inventory changes, gross margin, you would actually take and you would add in your own herd information on the left-hand side, or excuse me, on the right-hand side. Other income, maybe you had some interest or you sold something, you sold calves, you sold semen, you never know. So when you start to look at your economic summaries, what you need to do is you need to look at whether or not you beat the benchmarks or did they beat you. So again, when you start to look at your economic returns, you're looking at your gross incomes, you're looking at your pasture costs. I challenge you also to know your pasture costs. You know what it costs to have one animal on your pasture every single day during grass season. If you don't, we actually have a really good pasture cost sheet, Excel spreadsheet that was created by Jason Karsis at PRO-DAIRY. I use it for some of my farms in central New York. It's actually really complete. We look at seeding costs, we look at depreciation, we look at your land values. We also look at over a 3-year period, we look at what it costs in order to maintain that, and we create a number that we can use in order to add in for your pasture costs, because pasture is not free. It costs money whether that cow is on there or not. You are paying taxes on it. You may have a mortgage on it. You have interest to pay on it. So your pasture, you have taxes to pay. You have to allocate for that with your pasture costs. A lot of people say, oh, well, I have 10 cows, 3 of them are open, but I have free pasture. Unfortunately, if that cow is not making you money, you don't have free pasture because she's eating, but she's not producing a calf for you. She needs to go. So pasture cost is very important. A lot of people do not do that. People sometimes do not have a very good handle on their winter feed costs. How many bales of hay are we feeding? Are we feeding supplements? This year we had a really crappy year making hay. So are we feeding some extra corn? Are we feeding some protein tubs? What are we doing to offset some of those winter feeding costs? We've got cows that are heavy in calf. They need to be maintained so that we have really good, viable calves when they hit the ground that are up and moving and doing what they need to do. Winter feed costs are very important for the cow-calf herd. What's it costing you to feed that cow during the winter? Know your vet and medicine costs. I know that typically cow-calf herds have a traditionally low vet and medicine cost. The importance of vaccinations, again, like Dr. Rob said, vaccines are cheap, antibiotics are not. So vaccines cheap antibiotics, 500 cc bottle of Draxin runs you over $2,000. Multiply that out or divide that out on a 50 cow herd or something like that. So, you know, when you look at it on a per dose by dose basis, vaccine, very important, antibiotics, very expensive. So that will increase your rate if you don't have good handle on your medicine costs and have very little respiratory on your farm. Vets, we don't try to get vets out very often, but sometimes we have to. It's important, but there is a cost for them to come to the farm. Breeding fees, some folks do it, some folks don't. Some guys just run bulls, but bulls need to be accounted for, don't they? So we need to think about that as well. Any types of supplies, fuel and oil, repairs, custom hire, maybe you have somebody come in and bale all of your hay, or if you make baleage, you have somebody come in and cut, bale and wrap it. You know, understand where your custom hire, or maybe you have them spread manure for you. Marketing, obviously there is a cost of selling calves, selling cows. So there's always going to be a marketing cost. Interest, operating interest, if you have lines of credit or loans, absolutely you're going to have some interest. Labor, you may have labor, whether it's your hired labor or personal labor, you should always allocate something for labor. Your labor is not free. What's your opportunity cost? If you are not doing this, you're doing something else. So your opportunity cost is there. So you have to have some type of labor allocation for each cow, looking at that over the course of the year. Everybody has farm insurance, utilities, interest, machine and building depreciations, other costs, any other overhead costs, replacement costs, whether you're buying in replacement cows or bulls, you're going to have some type of cost there with that, because cows don't go forever. You need to replace them. You may be buying in young stock, females with different genetics, bulls with different genetics, trying to phase out cows. So you may have some replacement costs there. And that all really does go against a cow in itself. So obviously these numbers are arbitrary depending on the person, but when you start to look at your farm and what you are doing, these are the types of numbers that we need to really dig down deep and figure out where you are. By not having good records, not really knowing where to put things, you're not going to be able to hit your benchmarks. You're not going to be able to look at yourself in comparison to somebody else. That's the only way that we're going to make our farms and our businesses better, and look to see where we can get better, is by looking at the numbers, scrutinizing them, and then being able to make a plan. We do this in the dairy industry a lot. Every year we go through the dairy farm business summary. We have a lot of farms in New York State that actually do this. They submit their numbers and they actually benchmark themselves against other dairies that are equal in like sizes or not to themselves. So there's like a totality, but then there's also ones where you can look very singularly, you look at a group of farms that are similar to yours. So the farm that sends in the data looks at farms that are similar to theirs, and they're all across New York State. So they already do this in the dairy, and we should really be focusing on doing this in the beef industry. I know Dr. Mike Baker really pushed for this, and I think that he is really adamant about us trying to get some numbers together and really see so that we can improve our cow herd in New York State and improve our farms, because we want to make sure that they're viable. We want to make sure that you're prosperous. And by knowing your numbers, being able to benchmark against them, you will ultimately do what you need to do. So did you beat the benchmarks or did they beat you? That's from Harlan Hughes. He's a market advisor at Beef Magazine. So to wrap up, and I know that we're getting close to 8:30. A few things. One is know your production measures. Get a handle on your profit and losses. So know what your numbers are. Use FinPack or talk to an extension agent to help create economic benchmarks. And then utilize FinBin for those benchmarking purposes. So once you have your numbers, you'll be able to utilize FinBin even more appropriately to see where you are and help you improve. So I just want to put this up for a mama cow. That's a nice gate. When it would be a shame if someone smashed it, because we know how all those cows can sometimes be a little cantankerous. So anyway, with that being said, thank you so much. I hope it wasn't too long, and I hope that we can answer some questions.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for a very informative presentation. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself to ask, or you can put them into the chat box.
Is someone moderating the chat box?
Yes, I'm looking at the chat box. Well, we do have one. How about Cattle Max software?
Oh, absolutely. CattleMax is another one. Great question. Perfect. Yes, CattleMax is a great software program. It can be right on your phone. There's an app. Thank you for reminding me of that one. I just pulled out two, but yep, CattleMax is fantastic.
I did put a link to a survey in the chat box. So I would encourage you all to click on that link and take the survey after we're done here tonight. We'll also send you that link in a follow-up email. Okay, we have a question for Rob. How about Endovac beef vaccine?
Oh, Endovac. Well, Rich, you stumped me on that one. I'm not familiar with that vaccine. Is that the coliform?
I
E.
think
coli vaccine?
the question came from Tim Dennis. So Tim, if you'd like a better answer, maybe you could unmute yourself.
Yes, Rob, it's a salmonella extract vaccine.
Oh, yeah.
At one time it was Endovac bovis, and then it became Endovac beef and Endovac dairy. A lot of bull test stations, and we consign to a lot of bull test stations, recommend that the bulls have that before they get commingled. I have included it in the pre-weaning, pre-conditioning programs. It's used extensively in the Midwest. I just wondered what you knew about it.
Yeah, well, obviously not much. And so it's just a salmonella control measure they want to enforce?
Well, it's promoted to have a general gram-negative protection, even to the point where there may be some protection for pink eye and or respiratory disease.
Oh, all right. Yeah, nope. You stumped me on that one, Tim.
All right, we have a question probably for Nicole here. What's a good price to pay yourself per cow?
That's a good one. That can vary because it's basically, I'm going to have to think about that one and get back to you because that can be quite variable. Obviously, $15 an hour or $10 an hour, you're kind of looking at your total hours that you put on your farm. So say you're spending 60 hours at the farm and you are you could be doing something else with your time, say have a full-time job or whatever. Your opportunity cost is how many dollars are you kind of not getting by leaving that money on the table and not going out for a job. So you kind of have to look at how many hours you're looking at the farm. And then what you're going to do is take a dollar amount, whether you use minimum wage maybe, or $40,000 a year, divide that by the number of cows you have, and that would kind of give you your number there. Obviously, more cows, more time there. Mama cows usually less time, only more time during pasture season. Cows are out, all you're doing is checking them or moving them, maybe doing vaccines once every couple months, things like that, weeks. But look at the totality of hours that you're putting on the farm, and then maybe using minimum wage and then dividing that by your cow herd. So that number it's all dependent on you, but you should definitely pay yourself something for labor because it is considered an opportunity cost. Hopefully that answered your question.
We have another question here about having a forage analysis. Most feed mills are geared toward dairy around here. Are there any good resources for beef nutritionists in central New York, especially for having a custom bulk mineral mix made?
There are some. I know that most folks are more dairy focused in this area. But if you're already using, whether it's any of the major feed mills around here, you can ask them, please put me in touch with a beef nutritionist. You do not need to use the dairy nutritionist. You can request a beef nutritionist. If you use Blue Seal Kent, they have folks out in the Midwest that can get you to a beef nutritionist. That is what you pay for. So I think that you should start with your dairy nutritionist and ask them to put you in touch, or go online and look through their websites and call the tech support company and find out who to use. Because if you're paying for it, it's available to you. You just have to do some digging. The dairy guys sometimes don't want to give you that information, but if you're buying feed from them, you definitely should have the ability to get in touch with a beef nutritionist.
Our next question is, what is the best lice control for cows?
Oh yeah, I see, that's Mike. Yeah, it kind of depends on which type of lice you're dealing with, sucking versus chewing. If you're lucky enough that they're sucking lice, they probably respond to an ivermectin. They're taking a meal from the cow's tissues, and so they're going to get a dose of that drug. If they're chewing lice, those are a little bit harder to get rid of. So your pyrethrin drenches, lime sulfur drenches, both are efficacious. You got to repeat a couple of times because the eggs are pretty resistant. So you'll end up coming back 2-3 weeks later, do it again, 2-3 weeks later, do it again. They are tricky.
So there was a follow-up comment from Tim that he likes Ultra Boss. So is that a product for the sucking, or can someone expand a little bit more on the product Ultra Boss?
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Yes, it's a synergized product, and it's either be a spray, you can put it in a rub, or we use it as a pour-on, control lice and to control flies during the fly season. I haven't had resistance, and seems to be a good product for us.
What's
I
the
think
active
that's
ingredient?
a Merck product.
What's the active ingredient?
I should know this. It's a synergized permethrins and pyrethrins, I believe.
Okay.
Rich, I do want to just say one more thing about the gentleman that was asking about a custom mineral mix. Have him email me and I could probably get him in touch with, there's some private guys in New England that might be able to help him.
There was a second question related to minerals in the chat box. What brand of mineral mix do you recommend, and or what ingredients should the mineral mix contain?
I'm not a nutritionist. There's a lot, there is, Tim's smiling. I'm a farm business management specialist, not a nutritionist. There is a wide variety of minerals out there, whether they are, you know, from Tractor Supply to Cargill, Kent, Blue Seal. There is a Purina, there's a lot of SureChamp, Vitafirm. There's a lot of different minerals out there, and it all depends on your cows. It depends on your forages. But yeah, you've got to know what you're working with when it comes to your forages before you can really, and also looking at your deficiencies in your cows. And I know Rob will definitely talk about that. The other thing I know that we use a lot at the farm is we use multi-min, whether it's for our cows before breed up, or also our calves. We use multi-min a lot. That just helps too. So we know that they're getting an injection. And also they have loose minerals at all times. So there's different companies. It all depends on what you want to do. If you're using them for conception or you're just using them for maintenance, it all depends.
We did get a comment that if feeding a lot of corn or corn silage, calcium is low, so you need calcium. The calcium to phosphorus ratio should be around 2 to 1. Get what you pay for here, and you need a forage analysis.
Yep.
So at this point, I'd like to invite Mary Lynn Collins back on, and she can perhaps say a few final words here.
Sure. Thank you, Rich. And thank you all for your patience tonight as we work through our speaker changes and pulling up slides. I did want to just reiterate that this is just one of many of our upcoming programs for livestock producers here tonight, specifically for our beef producers here across the state. But please stay tuned to our efforts as we're going to start rolling out other programming that will address other livestock needs here in New York. So reach out to your local extension agents if you, by chance, are multi-species farmers and want more information. Stay in contact with your local extension agents because we can keep you in the know of upcoming program that'll be sure to help you out with your business endeavors. A big thank you to both Rob Lynch and Nicole for your time and efforts tonight and sharing your information. As a follow-up, a couple of things before we part. Check the chat box. It's after 8, folks. I'm winding down for the link for some follow-up questions from Rich. And also we will send a follow-up email with that link in case you've missed it, but also with PDF of our presenters' information for tonight. So unless there's any last minute questions, I thank you once again for joining us and have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.